The process of making tomato sauce begins right here in this building. The fresh tomatoes are received from the farmer. Each delivery is lab tested for pesticide residues. If the levels are too high, the farmer is returned with his produce. If the pesticide levels comply, the tomatoes are allowed to pass through to the next stage. After passing the compliance stage, the tomatoes are put on this conveyor belt for final inspection and sorting. Any rotten tomato finds its way back out at this stage. The tomatoes are then passed through the washer with hot water. This is to both soften the tomato and remove any impurity. The conveyor belt then passes the tomatoes onto another conveyor belt, where water is further sprayed onto the tomatoes. This particular conveyor belt contains little holes which serve to reduce the amount of water from the washer. They then arrive at a crusher. The tomatoes are then crushed and pumped into what is called a hot break machine, which heats up the tomato puree to extract the most amount of juice. The enzymes that are still active become denatured at this stage. It works through a steaming system, which utilizes a heat exchange process between the hot steam and the tomato pulp. The pulp then goes through these pipes and through two sieves. The first sieve removes any skin and seeds. The second sieve has finer holes, which only fine juice will be allowed to pass through. All the residue will be dropped out here and disposed. The refined juice is then collected in a holding tank. When enough volume is reached, which is 500 liters, it then moves to the next station. The initial juice extraction process takes approximately 30 to 45 minutes. After capacity is reached, the juice is then pumped from the holding tank through this line to the evaporator. The evaporator is where the water from the juice is extracted until we get a thick paste or puree. This paste is passed through a double-layered vessel where steam is being pumped in between the layers, heating the product. The water from the product is extracted through vapor. When this happens, the vapor is then pushed through the tank and cooled through a cooling tank, which converts the vapor to water, which is then collected as wastewater. It takes about 2 hours the evaporation process to reach the optimum solid texture. The solid is constantly monitored until desired specification is reached. A sample is taken through this tap to check optimum texture. Before testing, the product is circulated for 1 or 2 minutes to get the true consistency of the product. On approval, it then gets pumped into a blending tank where the special ingredients that give us that delicious taste are added and mixed. From this stage, it gets pumped straight into a pasteurizer. The product is rotated and brought to the boil. This board will measure the temperature until it maintains a steady temperature at a minimum of 80 degrees Celsius for 5 minutes. It is then considered pasteurized. The product is then pumped into another holding tank. This is a double-layered holding tank to hold the product prior to filling. Good old-fashioned gravity is used here to fill up the mini holding tank to ensure that filling is done accurately. This is a partially manual process. The bottles are washed, collected, and placed under the filling nozzle. The product is extracted through pressing on the stepping plate, allowing the specified quantity into the bottles. The bottles are then manually capped, then moved to the capping machine, which tightens the caps onto the bottles. After the bottle is capped, it then moves onto a coding machine, which will place the best before dates and batch codes onto the bottle. The batch codes are important to be able to trace the material from raw material up until the finished product. At this stage, the product is placed in incubation and samples are taken of each batch. The samples are taken to NAFTEC for lab testing. If the products are given the thumbs up, it then proceeds to the next stage. Back in the production room, the certified bottles then have branded plastic wrap manually placed on the bottlenecks. They then move onto a conveyor belt and through a vacuum seal machine, which will shrink plastic wrap onto the neck of the bottles. This process reaches up to 100 degrees Celsius to completely seal the product. This ensures that the product is indeed tamper-proof. Each bottle is then manually labeled. The final product goes through shrink wrap. The plastic wrapper then shrinks around the product according to supply, sometimes 6, 12 or 25 units per shrink. The product is placed in a box and is on its way to our dining room tables as the condiment tomato sauce.